In this video, we're going to be going over the most important lab safety rules used in every biology and chemistry lab from high school all the way to university. The first and most important rule is that you will always be working under the supervision of a teacher, teaching assistant, or professor, because their most important job is to show and demonstrate the procedure of the lab, which is actually what you're going to be doing, so that every student knows exactly what they need to do and exactly how to avoid any dangerous situations during the lab. This is so important that most of your teachers and professors will actually give you a mark based on how effectively you perform the lab and how safe you are during the lab itself. However, accidents do happen to the best of us, and therefore it is important for all students to know the location of the emergency equipment within the lab room. The two most important pieces of emergency equipment are a fire extinguisher to put out any out-of-control fires, and a first aid kit to treat any simple injuries that do not require medical attention. However, the best way to avoid injury is to avoid injury entirely, and the first step to avoiding injury is to wear the proper clothing to prevent anything bad from happening. As we can see with these two lab technicians here, the first and most obvious piece of protective clothing is the lab coat. This is not just for show. It is created of a thicker fabric that is designed to absorb chemicals and prevent them from getting onto your skin. As you will learn in both high school and university labs, if you come to school wearing shorts instead of long pants or sandals instead of closed-toed shoes, you will be denied entry because any exposed skin that you have is a potential danger for chemical spills. But of course, the most vulnerable location in your body are your eyes, which is why lab goggles are mandatory, especially during chemistry labs, because you don't want to go blind because of a chemical spill. Lastly, hair, especially long hair, is of particular vulnerability because it burns very, very easily. And if you've ever smelt the smell of burning hair, it is a uniquely unpleasant sensation. Therefore, if you have shoulder-length hair or longer, that means that you need to wear a hair tie to tie back your hair into a ponytail so that your long hair is not in danger of catching fire. Now, this is especially true under COVID conditions, but hand washing is absolutely mandatory. And again, make sure that you wash your hands with soap, not just after the lab is done, but before the lab as well, to make sure that your hands come into the lab clean and leave clean, to both to prevent contamination during the lab work and to prevent any potential chemicals on your hands mixing with food and poisoning you after the fact. Now, it should go without saying that if any accident happens, the very, very first thing to do is to inform your supervisor, whether this is a teacher or professor, immediately. Remember that accidents happen to the best of us, and no teacher or student is going to blame you immediately. Their primary concern is to make sure that everyone is okay. After this, retrieve the emergency equipment and deal with the emergency immediately. Do not wait to be told. Now let's talk about the types of accidents that might happen during a lab. The first category of accidents might occur with glassware. So with any equipment made of glass, the first thing that you need to do is check it for any breaks or any cracks. And one reason for this is if there's a crack in a container, you can get chemical spills. But the main danger that we want to avoid is something called temperature shock. Now, temperature shock is what happens when the temperature of a piece of glass changes from very high to very low very quickly. This temperature shock can result in a crack forming, but if there's already a crack there, it can result in the entire piece of glass shattering, effectively turning it into a small fragmentation grenade. Therefore, if there is any glassware that is cracked or broken, dispose of it in the proper container for broken glassware, which will usually be kept at the front of the lab. If the crack is small and you're not sure whether it's usable, your supervisor should be able to answer this immediately. Now, onto the big category of chemical-related accidents or chemical-related injuries. It should go without saying that under no circumstances are you allowed to eat or drink chemicals, even if the chemicals are used for food. For example, this wonderfully sweet-looking orange liquid is actually a highly potent carcinogen, and the only thing that you'll get if you were to drink this beaker is a healthy dose of throat cancer. In addition, if we take a look at what this student is doing here, where he is putting his nose directly into the container to smell the chemical, this is wrong. Avoid this behavior. Instead, hold the beaker about a forearm's length away and use your right hand in a swaying motion. This is what we call wafting, and use your hand to waft the fumes of the chemical towards your nose rather than inhaling directly so as to prevent overexposure. But of course, you should not be working with any chemicals that are unsafe to begin with. So for example, if we take a look at this rather suspiciously looking jug with a suspiciously cloudy chemical in it, we don't see a label, therefore we don't know what it is. Can you use it? Absolutely not. All chemicals that are safe to use should be labeled with the type of chemical, and if it has special instructions, there will be a warning label on the side of the container that you can read, and make sure to follow the instructions here to make sure that you aren't handling the substance in an improper way. So if you've made it through to the end of the lab and you have leftover chemicals, is it a good idea to return them to the original container? Well, in this case, the answer is definitely no, because we want to avoid any contamination. You've been working with these chemicals for a whole lab, which usually lasts for about an hour. Those chemicals have probably reacted with other chemicals in the air, and this can cause potentially dangerous chemical reactions if they are mixed with the original sample. Lastly, we need to talk about how to deal with acids. So acids are a family of chemicals. Usually they are liquids, and if you get acids on your skin, they can cause some potentially permanent and very, very painful burns. So the first thing that we need to talk about is how to dilute an acid, which is what happens where we take an acid and we want to weaken it so that it is safe to handle. Now, if we do this, we can usually add water in order to weaken the acid, but we will always want to pour the acid into the water and not the way around, because when we pour one liquid into another, occasionally there will be splashing. If this is water, it's going to be harmless if it exits the container, but if this is acid and it splashes, this can potentially get out of the container and burn your hands if you're not careful. So we do this again to avoid any acid splashing that might occur. Now, again, accidents do happen, and if you manage to spill a strong acid, which can cause some very nasty burns, we need to neutralize it, and neutralizing an acid involves adding the opposite type of chemical called a base, and when these two are mixed, they undergo a chemical reaction in order to create water, which we know is safe to handle. Finally, the last category is the big one. If there is an accident that occurs, especially in a chemistry lab, most of the time it involved fire. So the first and most important thing is to learn how to properly use and handle the two types of equipment that are used for heating and burning substances in a chemistry lab. On the left, we see this is a device called a Bunsen burner, and Bunsen burners are particularly dangerous to use because they're hooked up to a gas line, and if you are heating without fire, you would most likely be using the hot plate on the right. Now, let's say you're working on your lab and you need to take a break to go to the washroom. Is it a good idea to leave either of these devices on while you go? Of course not. So, at no point should there ever be an open flame or an openly hot piece of metal that is unattended in a lab. Even if you need to leave for 30 seconds, shut it off. It is better safe than sorry. In addition to this, all students need to know how to properly carry, how to properly turn on and turn off each of these devices here. Now, the important thing about carrying a hot plates take between 5 to 10 minutes in order to cool off because metal is very, very good at transferring heat. And after you unplug this and turn it off, obviously you don't want to pick it up and burn your hands carrying it. Now, remember that a Bunsen burner is actually hooked up to a gas line, so the first thing to do is to actually shut off the gas so that no fuel is getting into the Bunsen burner. At no point should you ever try to blow out the Bunsen burner because this is going to spread the fire and cause all sorts of damage around you. Now that you've learned the most important safety rules, you can test your knowledge by taking a look at this walking disaster in a form of a picture. See if you can identify at least 5 different problems with lab safety that are occurring in this disaster of a lab. Bonus points if you can find all of them.